Hi, everyone. Hello, thank you all for being here. Super excited to be having a conversation with my colleague, John Carreyrou. Not Carreyrou, he hates it when you miss that last R. And I'm just going to quickly read the bio that in your book. Two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. For his extensive coverage of Theranos, Carreyrou was awarded the George Polk Award for Financial Reporting, the Gerald Loeb Award for Distinguished Business and Financial Journalism in the category of beat reporting, and the Bartlett and Steele Silver Award for Investigative Business Journalism. Carreyrou lives in Brooklyn, New York, with his wife and 3 children. So, John,
yes.
I'm going to make an assumption that maybe not everybody knows about this amazing book that you wrote, Bad Blood, about Theranos, the blood testing Silicon Valley startup. Could you, maybe in a nutshell, tell the audience a little bit about what that work was about?
Right. So Theranos is a diagnostics startup that was founded in the heart of Silicon Valley back in 2003 by a young woman named Elizabeth Holmes, who dropped out of Stanford in her sophomore year. She had big ambitions of becoming a successful Silicon Valley entrepreneur. Steve Jobs, in particular, was her idol. And she also had a vision, which was for a portable blood testing device that would enable you to run the full range of lab tests off a tiny pinprick of blood pricked from the finger. And so she went about raising money and hiring employees and pursuing that vision for a period of about 12 years. And by 2014, 2015, became pretty famous in the Valley and beyond as the first kind of woman who had made it to, the heights of tech billionairedom. She joined the pantheon of all these other tech billionaires who had all been men, and she was the first woman, and she graced the covers of magazines and was on TV, and I guess then I came along in 2015 and did a 9-month-long investigation for the Wall Street Journal, having learned, in fact, that things were not really as they seemed, and that was published in October of 2015, and then gradually things fell apart for Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, and so the book is really about the whole arc of this story, and I thought, we can talk about why I thought this merited a book, but there seemed to be a lot of drama that made for good storytelling, but also a ton of themes packed into this story that were worth addressing, and so that's why I did this book.
Right, and so you reconstruct about 15 years of the company's history, is that right?
Right, yeah.
Right. So something that stood out to me is really the scale of the number of people you had to talk to. You did over 150 interviews, many employees, former employees. You got a lot of people to tell you a lot of things and put their own lives in danger. How did you do that?
Right, so when I first got a tip, as I recount in the book, that this would have been early February 2015, and it was a third-hand tip, really, and so I needed to kind of pull on the string and get to a primary source, and that first primary source was the outgoing laboratory director at Theranos, and so he was actually extremely well placed to know about the shenanigans that had transpired there, but he was also being threatened and harassed by attorneys working for the company. And when I made contact with him, he was really terrified and kind of in a fragile state of mind. And I had to do a lot of hand-holding, so to speak, and get him comfortable with me. And I had to grant him confidentiality, promise that he wouldn't be named as a source. And that was the beginning of this years-long reporting effort where I kind of had to do this over and over again with sources because this company had been, the culture at the company had been one of sort of fear and intimidation. It was quite a toxic culture, and Elizabeth Holmes, the founder of the company, had proven that she was willing to sue people more than once. She had sued a group of employees early on in the company's life, and then she had sued an ex-neighbor from her childhood over a patent, and by then the famous lawyer David Boies had become the counsel for Theranos, who had led that lawsuit. And so litigation, the threat of litigation was always in the air when you were working, when you were an employee at Theranos. And as a result, it made my work of trying to get these people to talk to me and to tell me what they knew very difficult. I know NDAs are common in corporate America, and especially in Silicon Valley. At Theranos, they were really used as a tool to muzzle people and to keep them from whistleblowing. So I had to do a lot of work to get around all that.
Let's talk about Holmes. You have amazingly never met her, yet the book is all about her and described in incredible detail. How did you do that? And also, how did, she's a very charismatic personality, surrounded herself by a formidable coterie of superstars, frankly. Could you talk a little bit about that board that she had? And they seem to be really a little bit obsessed with her as well.
Right. So she in fact never did agree to meet with me or to be interviewed by me, even though before the first story was published, I tried to get an interview with her for 5.5 months before we went to press, and then I sporadically went back again to her handlers, and again when I went on book leave for the book, and for the past 3.5, 4 years, she has steadfastly refused to engage with me. I never necessarily saw that as a non-starter because I've done quite a bit of investigative reporting, and oftentimes the subjects of investigative stories are reluctant to cooperate, and it's often a conflictual dynamic, and so I was used to that. In terms of your other question regarding the board, it was how did she manage to surround herself with such a board? And I think that
maybe you could talk to some of the people on the board as well.
Right. So one thing to know, I think, about Elizabeth Holmes is, this devolved into a fraud, but I don't think she dropped out of Stanford in 2003 as a 19-year-old sophomore, thinking that she was going to do a long con and, premeditating this long con. I don't think that's how it happened. I think she was really an entrepreneur who wanted to succeed, and had a vision that she pursued. The problem is she wanted to succeed at all cost, and that's when it became problematic, because over the years she stopped listening to advice, and she started cutting corners and cheating. And the reason I'm bringing this up is I think that one of the reasons she was able to convince people and wow people and kind of mesmerize people again and again is that it wasn't all just a lie. A big part of her did really believe in what she was trying to do, and this notion especially that the product that they were trying to deliver was a blood testing product that could, enable what medicine had never been able to do before, test quickly on these small samples of blood. And so in her mind, it was the outcome of all these efforts were going to be good for medicine and good for society. And so I don't think she ever lost that part of her that's idealistic, was always there, and I think it helped convince people as she encountered people along the way. She wasn't just conning them. Part of her was conning them because she was exaggerating. she would encounter these setbacks with these different iterations of the technology, and then she would paper over them and pretend that they hadn't happened, and go on promising the moon to investors and to board members and to doctors and patients. And it got to a point where the gap between the promises and her assertions about what she'd achieved and what she'd really achieved was enormous, and it de facto became a fraud. But I think that explains, her ability to convince people, because part of her is just this idealistic woman who's constantly pitching people on her vision.
So let's talk about the fact that she is a woman. I think that a lot of conversations have been had. I've been talking to people here, and we've had this conversation that she was the female hero that everybody was gunning behind. We really wanted her to succeed. Could you talk a little bit about that? When you're writing the book, you also talk a lot about her boyfriend, Sonny,
right.
And that relationship is very central to the narrative.
Right. Yeah, I mean, gender, it obviously is controversial nowadays amid the Me Too movement, but gender undeniably played a role in this story. The reason, or certainly she capitalized on this yearning for a woman who would succeed to the extent that all these other men had in Silicon Valley. And there was a hunger for this, and when she started emerging as that person in late 2013 and then throughout 2014, people were ready to jump on that bandwagon, whether it be women or men. Frankly, everyone wanted this, and so she was able to play to that desire, and then the interesting thing is that in the background was her sort of partner and consigliere, Sunny Balwani, who was almost 20 years older and who she had met, her summer between high school and college. And that relationship was kept secret and kept behind sort of a curtain. And she didn't even tell the board. I mean, certainly the board knew that he was the number 2 of the company. He was president and chief operating officer. But no one knew that they were living together, that they'd been a couple for a decade. A lot of employees suspected it, and some employees, there was a lot of turnover at Theranos, but there were some employees who were there from the beginning, and they knew for a fact that they were together. But as new employees got hired, generations of new employees got hired, they would never be told that there was a relationship between number 1 and number 2, and the board was never told. And then when she rose to fame and she started gracing the covers of magazines and giving interviews, it was always suggested that she was like this, young, reclusive Silicon Valley founder who was still single.
Why is it important to know? Why is it important to know that she was in a relationship?
It was important to know for many reasons. One was that they were running this, she and Sonny were running this company together. And to the extent that they were cutting corners and that they were lying and they were cheating, they were doing it, they were masterminding this whole thing as a couple. Another way in which it's relevant is he was sort of running operations on a day-to-day basis, especially as she was doing more and more media and becoming a fixture at conferences in the 2013-2015 period. He was the guy running the company on a day-to-day basis, and this is a guy who had zero medical background, knew nothing about blood testing or diagnostics, came from a software engineering and sales background, and thought that somehow he could just apply that culture to what was a medical and a healthcare firm, and that proved to be disastrous. So that was another way in which it was relevant. It was relevant, from a corporate governance point of view. I think the board would have liked to know, and investors would have liked to know that they were a couple, but it was hidden.
All right. Let's talk about chemiluminescent immunoassays. Mm-hmm. comes up a lot in the book. What did you have to do to learn about all of this science?
Yeah, I mean, I had done a lot of reporting, and in particular a lot of investigative reporting on healthcare and on medicine, but never really, I had done a story about laboratories for a series on Medicare fraud the year prior to the Theranos story. But other than that, I had no background to speak of or expertise in this area, blood testing. And so I kind of had to start from scratch and speak to a lot of experts. I mean, some of the sources, such as the outgoing laboratory director who goes by Alan Beam in the book, that's actually a pseudonym. He explained a lot of things to me, but then I also started making these sources who were directors of laboratories at universities like the University of California, San Francisco, another guy at Vail Cornell in New York, and ended up over the course of several months taking a crash course on blood testing. And if you want to know, chemiluminescent immunoassays, immunoassays refer to a category of blood tests, and there are roughly 4 or 5 big categories of blood tests. And the reason this is important to the Theranos story in particular is that up until Theranos came along and Elizabeth Holmes came along, no one had been able to come up with a way to do those 4 or 5 different categories of blood testing on a tiny sample of blood. Why? Because each category requires completely different laboratory techniques and instruments. And so when you're done using your tiny pinprick of blood to do an immunoassay like a prostate cancer test or a vitamin D test or a thyroid test, then you've got no sample left. And unfortunately, you need to have sample left because if you want to do a general chemistry assay like a cholesterol, test to measure cholesterol, you need completely different instruments and techniques. And so there has to be more volume. No one had cracked that nut until Elizabeth Holmes came along and claimed that she had. And it's now become obvious that she hadn't.
Right. So what was it like? So you were writing, obviously, for the journal, many stories about this. And what was the process like going from writing news stories to this book? Was it a smooth process? Was it messy? How did you do that?
The reporting, I had to do a ton more reporting for the book because what I had covered in my reporting for the journal was really the latter years of the company and what went wrong from essentially the summer of 2013 on. But what I had very little information on is how it had all started and how it had evolved. And I felt that the whole story merited to be told because it wasn't, I intended the book to be not just a story of a corporate scandal and the story of a fraud, but also a story about how things could go wrong in Silicon Valley in the environment that we're now in, which some people would disagree, but I consider it sort of a second bubble. If you consider that the first bubble was the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, and now we have this 15 years, 20 years later, we have this second bubble, which is the unicorn bubble with these enormous sums of money flowing into the valley and being thrown at these college dropouts. And some of these companies have reached enormous valuations of $50 or $60 billion. And so for me, it was not just a story of any other corporate scandal. It was going to be a story that said a lot of things about Silicon Valley, which, by the way, has become hugely important to our culture. It's become hugely important to our economy. The previous breed of startups, the likes of Apple and Facebook and Google are, and if you stretch the definition of what Silicon Valley is, Amazon, I mean, these are the biggest companies now in our country. 2 of them have reached $1 trillion in market caps. We all have iPhones. We all have Facebook accounts. I mean, it's become hugely important to our society, to our economy. Culturally, people graduate from Ivy League schools, and they're no longer trying to go to Wall Street. They're trying to go to Silicon Valley because they want to become the next Mark Zuckerberg. So to me, Silicon Valley felt like a very important story, the larger story of Silicon Valley, and I felt like this particular story within that larger story deserved to be told, and to be told well, the whole story had to be told. So long story short, I had to go back and do a lot of reporting for the book, and nothing changed about my methods or how I approached the reporting. What completely changed from when I was reporting for the journal to writing the book is writing. At the journal, and this may be true of many of your news organizations, you kind of have to attribute every single sentence, which sometimes doesn't make for fantastic and smooth reading. And in a book, if you want, if you want the book to be readable and people to turn the pages, then the writing has to kind of be more engaging, more colorful, more fluid. And so I took off my Wall Street Journal hat and I sort of put it in a corner, and I put on my nonfiction writer's hat. And I tried to, while remaining very rigorous on the facts, tried to write with the shackles off. Hopefully people like the result.
I also understand there's a film and a documentary being made, and we have Jennifer Lawrence cast as Elizabeth Holmes.
Attached to play Elizabeth Holmes, yes.
And what was that process like? Was it an obvious thing for you to want to be involved in a documentary and a film?
Yeah, my first thought as things were escalating in the months preceding the first story we published, and sources were being followed and threatened, and we were getting threatened, and it was like, I feel like I'm in a movie. So that the notion that this might be a movie, it almost came to my mind before the notion that this would be a book. But in any case, after the first story and the impact that it had, I started thinking seriously about pitching a book, which I did to a few publishers very quietly in early 2016, because at that point I was still getting threatened with litigation by David Boies, and so was the journal. Those threats seemed very credible still. And so my agent and I decided that we would shop the book proposal quietly. And so we printed out 5 copies of it, and he took them and hand delivered them to 5 publishing houses in Manhattan. And he told each of the editors that a punctuation mark had been changed in each copy, and that if their copy leaked to scouts, that we would know it was them. And so that worked. The process remained secret, and Knopf ended up being the publisher that I signed up with. And then word started spreading in Hollywood that the journal reporter who'd broken the Theranos story, which was still in the news because there was like this rolling fallout still from the reporting with the regulatory inspections and then her ban from the lab industry. Word got out that the Wall Street Journal reporter had gotten a book deal, and so they found out that my agency was William Morris, and people in Hollywood started knocking on the door and calling up WME, at which point a film agent from WME got in touch with me and said, listen, you got to get ahead of this. There's a lot of interest in Hollywood. And if you don't preempt it and take control of the situation, some screenwriter off the street could just write a screenplay inspired from your reporting, and that'll be the Theranos movie. And so I said, okay. So she said, let me send you, I told her I wanted to shop the proposal to a small circle of screenwriter, producer types. And she said, okay, let me send you a list of 10 names, and then we can call it down to 5 and go and send the proposal to those 5. So she sends me a list, and the names at the top of the list are Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese, and it's just like these legendary names in Hollywood. George Clooney, and so on and so forth. And so I thought, wow, this is great and stuff, but has Martin Scorsese done a movie like this? Has Steven Spielberg really done anything comparable? And if we pitch them and end up going with someone that big, to what extent is that going to be like the 101st project in their queue, and will the movie ever get made? And so we caucused, and I decided to like cut some names off that list, and so Steven Spielberg got discarded, and Martin Scorsese got discarded, and a few others, Christopher Nolan, and we had a list of 5 names that I felt were still pretty well-known people, but I felt were more appropriate in terms of like their body of work and how how it sort of transferred to this Silicon Valley parable. And in the end, two of the 5 that we approached were really interested. One was the guy who had written the screenplay for the movie Spotlight, and the other was Adam McKay, who had directed The Big Short and co-written that screenplay. And in the end, we went with McKay because he seemed to want it more. He wanted it the most. And he seemed to really get the story and to love the story. Obviously, The Big Short, he had done a great job adapting the Big Short, which is not an easy book to adapt for the big screen. And so we gave him the project, and then it so happened that Jennifer Lawrence is a big fan of his. Before The Big Short, McKay had done a lot of comedies, in particular comedies starring Will Ferrell, his good friend. And Jennifer Lawrence, it turned out, loves Adam McKay's Will Ferrell comedies, and one of her favorite movies of all time is Step Brothers, which is a comedy starring Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly, I think circa 07 or 08. And as a result, Jennifer Lawrence for several years had wanted to work with Adam McKay, and so he called her up and he said, "Hey, I've got this project. What do you say?" And within a day or two, she had signed on. And then the 3 of us went to studios, or rather our representatives went to studios, and there was a big interest. And within a week or 2, we had a deal.
Amazing. I'm going to move shift a little bit to the coverage prior to the tip that then led to your own reporting. The Wall Street Journal, I believe, was the first news outlet to actually profile Elizabeth Holmes, or
right.
Among the first.
Yeah, that's
and
one
it was
of
a very flattering one.
Right.
Could you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. It's one of the interesting twists of this whole tale. When Elizabeth Holmes and her boyfriend Sonny made the decision to go live with the supposedly innovative fingerstick blood tests in the fall of 2013, she engineered via George Shultz, the former Secretary of State who was on her board, an interview in the Wall Street Journal with the Wall Street Journal's opinion page. And Schultz had been a longtime friend of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, which is famously conservative, and Schultz is still considered a towering figure in Republican circles. And so through that Schultz connection, she was able to engineer this piece, which was a friendly interview with a Wall Street Journal editorial page writer. And unfortunately, because he did not know he was being lied to, he took everything that she said in her interview with him at face value, and the resulting piece, which took up most of a page in the editorial section, the opinion section of a Wall Street Journal, I think on Saturday, I think the 8th of September 2013. Unfortunately, that was like the first piece that put her on the map in the mainstream media, and introduced her to sort of a larger public. So when I came on the scene some 2 years later, I quickly became aware of that story, which I hadn't seen at the time, or rather that editorial page piece, and that was something I had to navigate, knowing that another part of our publication had written about her very favorably. And one thing that most of you probably know is that newspapers have, a newsroom and then an editorial page, and they're really two separate parts of the organization. At the Journal, that separation is really strict, and there really is a Chinese wall between the two. The Wall Street Journal editorial page's opinions have no bearing on the newsroom, and there's hardly ever any interaction between the two parts of the paper. And it's happened in the past that our edit page has contradicted or criticized news side reporting. One precedent was when the Journal did a big series of stories exposing options backdating at companies back in 06, 07, which, by the way, one ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize. There was a writer on the edit page side who spent the better part of a year writing pieces denigrating that coverage as as silly, because options backdating was not really a crime in his view. So there had been instances of the two sides of the paper disagreeing, and I figured when I started reporting the Theranos story, and if it was going to turn out as I thought it was based on what people were telling me, it was going to be another one of those instances where the two sides of the paper did different things.
One of the more dramatic aspects of Wall Street Journal's role in this and the company generally is that Elizabeth Holmes actually visited our offices several times, and she met with Rupert Murdoch.
Not technically the Wall Street Journal offices, but she did come to the building. The Journal was acquired by the Rupert Murdoch's company, News Corporation, back in 07, and in 2009, he moved the Journal's offices to the News Corporation building in Midtown, and his office was back then on a higher floor in that building, and unbeknownst to me, she came and lobbied him essentially to kill the story. At that point, I didn't even know that Rupert was an investor in the company. So I would learn all of these things later, actually, when I was reporting the book. And I was pretty stunned when I found all of that out.
Amazing. I want to talk to you a little bit about, in your book, you acknowledge the mentorship of your editor. What role does mentorship play in your work generally, and how important is it to an investigative journalist to have that type of thing?
So my editor at the Journal is named Mike Sicanolfi, and he's been at the paper a long time. I like to joke that he's been there since the early 1900s, but actually he joined in 1984. And he's kind of a legendary figure at the Journal. He's really a great editor, had a sterling reporting career before he became an editor, and he's been an investigative editor for a long time now. And I think one of the reasons he's so great is that he really champions you. If he thinks you're onto a big story, and if he thinks you're right, not only does he get really excited about the story and making it happen with you, he also champions you internally and is really quite relentless about that. And so you feel like doing tough investigative pieces, it's often kind of like going to battle. You're battling with the subject, whether it be an institution or a powerful person. Sometimes you're fighting internal battles with the vetters at the paper. And when you're going to battle with Mike, that you're on a winning team, because he just never gives up and he supports you so much. And so that's really, really important. It's much harder to do this kind of work if your editor is not 100% behind you. The other great attribute about Mike is that he trusts his reporters, especially reporters who have a track record of delivering, and he's willing to give you a long leash. If you tell him, I need a month to figure out if there's something here. will you give me that time? And unfailingly, he tends to say yes. And he'll give you that long leash. And in this case, it was really important that he give me kind of that time to start bringing this story home.
You also thank all the legal help that was part. This story could not have been done without our legal colleagues.
Right.
Could you talk about that? What was that like?
Yeah, and actually one of the things I learned personally in the course of reporting the first Theranos story is it helps tremendously if you bring the vetters. At the journal, we have two layers of vetters. We have the standards and ethics editors. There are a couple of them, and then the lawyers. And it helps tremendously, I learned, if you bring some of them under the tent early on in the reporting process. Sometimes you can consult with them about how to handle something, but just the fact that you make them aware of what you're working on early and how difficult a project it is and sensitive, so that by the time you get to the point where you're ready to publish some months later, they're not being presented with this at the 11th hour or being asked to sign off on it with very little time, to weigh things and to consider things. And I ended up bringing Jay Conte, who at the time was the Deputy General Counsel. Dow Jones is now General Counsel, pretty early on to the point that he, along with Mike and I, attended this kind of surreal 5-hour showdown with David Boies and his henchmen in a conference room at the Journal. And Jay was there, participating and doing battle with us. And that was in June of 2015, and the story was only really got published in October, so it was 4 or 5 months later. And Jay had been involved and aware of the story at that point and kind of knew it like the back of his hand, and that made it a lot easier to get that last green light to go to press with the story. It also gave he and his colleagues time to vet the story really carefully. So I would recommend sometimes when you're doing really big, sensitive stories to bring the vetters under the tent at an earlier stage than you might think is wise.
So on the sort of thread of lawyers, some of the scenes in the book are pretty frightening. The threats, the intimidation to sources and to employees at Theranos. Were you ever yourself afraid? Were you scared by some of this intimidation? Did it frighten you?
I mean, I wasn't. People have asked me if I was ever, scared for my physical well-being, and I don't think it ever reached that point. Was I stressed out? Yes, I was extremely stressed out. When your sources are suddenly disappearing and you have no idea what's happening to them, which is what happened with Tyler. He suddenly, became unreachable, and it was radio silence, and I suspected they were putting the screws to him.
Tyler Schultz is...
Tyler Schultz, the grandson of George Schultz, who was on the board of Theranos. Tyler was one of my key sources. When you know that 2 or 3 of your sources are being surveilled, when your letters are landing from David Boies, arguably the most famous lawyer in America, on a daily or weekly basis, threatening you with litigation, all that is quite stressful. And my biggest stress, I think, stemmed from the fear that all these efforts that Theranos and Boies-Schiller were putting into discrediting the story and discrediting the sources, that they would bear fruit and that they would succeed in destroying the scaffolding of my reporting. I was very worried about that. That was my biggest source of stress. And so the day that publication came was in some ways an enormous relief, because the story was finally out and they had failed in stopping its publication.
So we're going to open up to Q&A in a couple of minutes. So there are microphones in the middle of the room. So if you have questions, please queue up and think about your questions. I do want to, there is one more story I would love for you to recount when we talk about sort of this culture of this toxic culture in the organization. There was an arcade game, Space Invaders, created in your honor. Could you tell us about that?
Right. So I only learned about this after I had handed in the manuscript, and the book was like a month from being published. But I heard from a former Theranos employee that a game had been created modeled after the 1980s game Space Invaders, the Atari game, in which my Twitter photo had been used as like the invader coming down the screen. And the machine gun at the bottom was Theranos' mini lab. It's the last iteration of its technology, and it was spewing bullets, which were little red bullets, which were the nanotainer, the tiny blood vial that Theranos had created as part of its technology. And so the little mini lab was, spewing these nanotainers and killing the invader, which was me. And I found it really funny at that point because, the threats had stopped and I had been proven right. And Holmes and Balwani had even been charged with fraud by the SEC at that point. And so I just tweeted about it, about having heard this anecdote. And the Theranos employee who created that game saw my tweet and reached out to me, DM'd me, and then we emailed. And he explained to me that he had created this game back in, I think it was winter of 2016, when he was still a believer in Theranos, and he believed that I was a hater and that, I was this rogue reporter bent on taking down this company and its founder. And he explained to me that he had since come, to understand that my reporting was correct and that he had been wrong then. And so he asked me to forgive him, and I was like, no problem. And he said, do you want me to send you a copy of the game? And I said, absolutely, please do. And so a couple of days later arrived this hard drive with the game on it. And I had the tech people at the Journal set it up on a laptop. And we actually filmed a video of me playing the Theranos, the Space Invaders Theranos edition.
It's amazing. All right, let's go to questions. Can we start over here? And maybe it would be wonderful, yes, if you could say who you are in the beginning.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for your time, John. My name is Joseph Jiha. I'm a reporter out of the Bay Area News Group in the San Francisco Bay Area. The Mercury News is the more common name. I'm a reporter covering a geographic beat, so I cover things from city council meetings to local accountability as much as I can. I'm spread pretty thin. I love the work, and my favorite stuff is investigative, even if it's not as deep as the kind that you do so fantastically. But my main question to you is about an intimidation factor of a lack of knowledge. I'm spread pretty thin. A lot of reporters have to cover wide areas of coverage. You mentioned about having to speak to so many experts at different universities,
right,
to kind of bone up on this very advanced technology that was on the cusp of not even existing, and about where the line was to understand it. Even in a very experienced reporter like yourself, do you ever find yourself coming up on concerns of just being called out as wrong or not understanding it fully? And how do you cope with that? And what do you do with your sources to make sure that you're getting the best info for your abilities to understand?
Right. I don't know if there's a perfect answer to that. But what you described definitely was at play with this story. I mean, we had in this surreal showdown with David Boies and his associates in June of 2015 that lasted for 5 hours. We had these lawyers insisting that the Theranos technology was innovative, and that that they were legitimately defending and protecting trade secrets, and it was definitely. I mean, that was something that definitely was a challenge, because could you ever know for certain that they were BSing? Even during that meeting, it seemed to me like if they knew that they were telling lies, those lawyers, they were very convincing. The one employee they had brought was the de facto number 3 at the company, this guy Daniel Young, who was a PhD in an MIT PhD, very smart guy. His forte was biostatistics, and he was, using complicated jargon and being elusive in the way he answered questions. But it was hard to sort of know 100% for sure that we were right and that the company really was cheating and really hadn't achieved what it claimed to have achieved. And I kept going back to my sources, to my confidential sources, and especially to the laboratory director, and had him re-explain things to me like 20 times. And then I would go to my source at UCSF, who was the director of labs there, and I would tell him everything that Alan Beam had told me, and did it make sense, and was I on the right track? And and finally I got to a point where I just knew in my heart that they were lying. But in this case, that uncertainty loomed over the whole story for a long time. And I think I was finally, at the end of the process, able to get everyone to dispel that uncertainty, meaning my editor or the vetters at the paper, where we all felt confident that, in fact, we had gotten to the bottom of this. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
That was fantastic. I was just going to say thanks very much for the thoroughness. Appreciate it.
Oh, was that a pun?
And I should mention that I cover the city of Newark, where they had a lab facility there. And
not anymore, because they've been evicted and
they closed it. Yeah,
right,
there's a lot of other reputable companies in that same group. But
Yep.
Vice President Joe Biden visited and called the tech inspirational, and I covered that as well. And
the laboratory of the future, he was shown, they had stacked these mini lab prototypes in this one room, and he was shown that room and told that was the Theranos lab. In fact, the Theranos lab was in 2 other rooms.
Behind a curtain, essentially. Yes.
Right, and so he was shown this fake lab, essentially.
Yeah. And he had intimated at a presidential endorsement too, naming President Barack Obama as, we believe in your cause, essentially. And so I just wanted to, reiterate how grateful we are for your work and how inspirational it is. And that is a pun.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Go over to the second microphone.
Hi, I'm Sarah Maslin-Neer. I'm a reporter at the New York Times. First, a cautionary tale before my question. All of us are journalists here, and we've all been approached at a holiday party by like a well-meaning family friend with like, do I have a story for you? I got a pitch. About 6 years ago, a friend's dad who works in medical device technology came up to me and said, there is a young woman emerging on the scene, and she's a total fraud. So people, listen to those drunk uncles. So kudos for listening. I wanted to know sort of specific investigative tips you have for converting a reluctant source, or you have incredibly adversarial sources. What are your strategies for getting them to crack?
Right. So again, I don't know if there's a super neat answer or a recipe, but I think my strength one of my strengths as a reporter has been my ability to create a rapport with sources. And that means spending a lot of time with them, either talking to them on the phone or meeting up with them, getting to know them. And I know that for people who are covering beats and having to cover breaking news almost on a daily basis, sometimes you don't have that luxury to source up like that and to spend all that time. But it really is the secret to breaking, the biggest stories, is to get to know people and get them to trust you. And, I think these sources on the other end of the phone and then on the other end of the table when you meet them in person, they need to know that you're a human being too. They need, sometimes it comforts them to know a little bit about your personal life and the fact that you have kids and a family and, some stories about your past, and where's the line between a source and a friend? Sometimes that line gets blurred a little bit, but I think that especially in very sensitive situations like the one I was presented with Alan Beam, the outgoing lab director, he needed to trust me. And the way to build that trust is to spend a lot of time with the person, either on the phone or in person. And sometimes you can't give them the sense, oftentimes you can't give them the sense that you're trying to shake information out of them right then and there during that first conversation or even during the second conversation. You got to play a longer game, and usually my experience is that the longer game pays off. So patience and also not being afraid of letting the source know who you are and getting a glimpse of your humanity and your personality, and because it is almost like a friendship that gets created, and of course you also have to remind yourself and your source that you're not a friend, because there's a lot riding over the relationship if you're building up to a big story, but sometimes it does almost morph into a friendship.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the story as well.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm Eitan Horowitz. I work at Apple, and just want to say congrats on an amazing book. If anybody hasn't read it, you definitely should. I mean, I followed the story and thought I knew a lot of it, but there's so much more in the book, which is just really, really good. And wanted to ask about one of the things that struck me in reading the book is that at several of these companies that worked with them, Safeway, Walgreens, and I think the Army, there were people that tried to sort of blow the whistle and kind of call it out, and ultimately weren't able to. And I wonder, after everything came out and kind of came crashing down, did any of those people sort of get some vindication or redemption within their own companies or careers? Because it seems like some of them kind of took a hit for even trying to speak out. Right.
So one person who comes to mind is Lieutenant Colonel David Shoemaker, who had basically become an obstacle to Elizabeth Holmes in the 2011, 2012, 2013 period, because he just didn't think that her regulatory approach held water, and he essentially was the one who alerted the FDA and CMS. And I think for someone like him to see the whole story blow up and become a book, has been very vindicating. I mean, he was a low-ranking sort of Army officer, and he did what he did because that was, he was very serious about doing his job and doing it well. And soldiers' lives are at stake when it comes to experimenting on them. And I think he's one of the heroes of the story, one of the many heroes. It didn't really have any career repercussions for him because he had retired. He had long ago retired. He retired in mid-2013. But he's looking back on his career now, and this is one of the highlights. In terms of other people, I'm told by very good sources that David Boies has come to accept that the journal's reporting was correct, and that Theranos was indeed a fraud. And so, that's vindicating as well. And then there are a lot of people who played minor or major roles in this saga, whose lives were impacted in different ways. There's Kevin Hunter, the lab consultant who was hired by Walgreens to essentially help them check Theranos out and due diligence, and Walgreens ended up essentially ignoring him, and his attempts to blow the whistle failed. And if Walgreens had listened to him, had only really listened to him and taken his concerns seriously, possibly none of this would have snowballed into what it became. So I think it's vindicating for a guy like him as well.
Great, thanks.
Hello. My name is Elijah Wolfson. I'm the health and science editor at Quartz. So my question is, basically in our space, we rely on things like assessing studies that have been peer-reviewed and therefore are ostensibly accurate, and then signifiers like investors with a track record having presumably done their due diligence when they're investing in companies, and then other sort of outside signifiers like that to validate the accuracy of the work of companies like Theranos. And even when there are red flags, it's often really hard or impossible to get beyond that unless you have, the Sarah's drunk uncle or your, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your case, the whistleblower, Tyler came to you, right?
Yeah, I would say the most important source was Alan Beam, the outgoing lab director, because he had been in that senior position in the lab, whereas Tyler and Erica Chung were important sources as well, but they were young, greener, more junior employees, and they were really good to have as corroborating sources. But I don't think I would have pulled it off without the more senior source.
Right.
He was the first source, and he was by far the most important source, and really the source upon which everything rested.
Right. So, well, in any case, I guess my question really is, how much do we need to assume that anything we see from the outside is a lie, and how do you get beyond that, those barriers?
I mean, I think that you can use, if you see something that seems off, and whether it be in a peer-reviewed study or another publication, or somehow something comes to your attention, I think you should follow your nose and try to dig more deeply. But oftentimes you do need to get to sources who are on the inside of whatever is going on, whether it be a company or a government agency. You need that first-hand reporting. You can't just build the story on circumstantial evidence. I mean, there were whispers in the laboratory industry that Theranos, may not have really achieved what it had achieved, and there were opinion pieces written by two laboratory scientists. One was John Ioannidis at Stanford in JAMA, I think in February or March of 2015, and then another guy whose name I can't remember. It's another Greek-sounding name, who's a laboratory a scientist at the University of Toronto, and he also wrote about sort of how skeptically about what Theranos was claiming. I think there was also a piece by a reporter for Business Insider in July of 2015, kind of expressing skepticism about Theranos' claims. And all these people were on the right track, but they didn't have the goods. And it's really hard to bring down a house of cards like this unless you have the goods, meaning unless you have those primary inside sources. And so I think you can use the circumstantial evidence to guide you and to tell you to basically tell yourself to follow your nose, but then you do have to do that extra work, and that extra work is really hard. I mean, I don't know how else to put it.
Thank you. Well done, sir.
So we have time for one more quick question, and then everybody else who's been waiting, John, if you have a few minutes afterwards, perhaps we could take those questions outside. If you have
a few minutes.
A few minutes. So yes.
All right, thanks. My name is Blythe Terrell, and I'm a podcast editor at Gimlet Media. And I have a fairly quick question, which is, I'm just wondering if you have tipsters or would-be tipsters coming out of the woodwork now, alleging all kinds of Silicon Valley fraud, and if so, kind of how you manage that deluge.
I have would-be tipsters, landing in my email inbox or via LinkedIn almost on a daily basis. Not necessarily only about Silicon Valley. In fact, I'd say a minority of tips are about Silicon Valley, a small minority. But surprisingly few of these are stories that merit follow-up. Maybe not that surprisingly, because I've been a reporter for 20 years, and it's been my experience that, it's like your hit rate is like 1 in 20, if not even smaller in terms of tips. So I haven't had like the next enormous story land in my inbox yet, if that's what you're asking.
I mean, yeah, a little bit. Thank you, appreciate it.
Right, let's be sneaky and just take one more.
Okay.
Hi, Sarah Fallon. I'm at Wired. Sorry about the story that we did. My question was about Tyler Schultz and sort of the bravery that he showed, and I was wondering sort of how you treated him as a source because he was so young, and how you felt when he went dark, and then when he sort of reemerged and had kind of held his ground under incredible pressure.
So that was a really delicate situation. You're right to point out the age difference. At the time I was in my early 40s, and he was barely in his mid-20s. And I tried to be upfront with him about everything, that I tried to spell out the risks but also the potential payoff of his playing ball with me. I think he was already in sort of a position where he wanted to unburden himself when he and I first made contact, because he'd been keeping it bottled in since he had left the company a year prior, and he had concerns about his grandfather's reputation. He had concerns about patients and getting inaccurate blood test results. So it's not like he was super reluctant. What made him reluctant, like all the other ex-employees, was the NDAs and the company's culture of threats and legal intimidation. But you're right, that was one of the most delicate sourcing relationships that I had to navigate. But the one thing I'll say about Tyler is that he's a smart guy, and he's pretty mature, and he's got a great head on his shoulders and a really strong moral compass. And I never felt like I made him do something that he didn't want to do. He's strong-willed enough as a person that everything that he did, including going on the record later in late 2016, he came to those decisions, himself, and like a big boy. And so it was delicate, but he's also like a strong young man, and I didn't feel at any point like I was manipulating him or anything.
Okay,
Does that answer your question? Yep.
I feel really bad because this lady has been waiting so long. Let's sneak one more in.
One more.
I promise
Okay.
one more.
Hi, my name is Mary Fallon. I'm a Silicon Valley veteran reporter. And my question is, how culpable are the venture capitalists in Silicon Valley for what happened? And did they present a lot of obstacles to you, or did eventually they start to see that they should, cooperate?
Well, I hear nowadays this refrain from some parts of the venture capital community in Silicon Valley that, we actually never fell for this. Because, if you look at the roster of investors, especially the ones that came in the late rounds and poured $700 million in, there's no sophisticated VC firm, certainly not any with any med tech investing experience. And so they're saying, like, actually, this shows that Silicon Valley works in the way it operates. I don't fully buy that because I think VCs and even the big firms are indirectly responsible for the environment that's been created out there, the cult of the startup founder, the myth of the startup founder who is a precocious genius and who can see around corners. That's been, they contributed to building that myth largely.
Most definitely.
And another guy who's to blame is Steve Jobs. Unfortunately, not to say that Steve Jobs was a fraud. Steve Jobs accomplished amazing things, but the problem is that the myth of Steve Jobs has such an influence over the younger generation in the Valley, and people buy into this idea that these startup founders can do no wrong, and that they're infallible, and that they're always right. And we have another sort of drama playing out right now in the Valley, which is Elon Musk and Tesla. And there are, some parallels with Theranos. To be sure, Tesla makes real cars, and for the most part, they work. But there is a cult of personality around Elon Musk as well. And I think the venture capitalists are in part responsible for this myth-making, and it certainly played a role in the Elizabeth Holmes story.
Yeah, and people have short memories. I covered Steve when the first 10 years at Apple, and it was all downhill, pretty much. And so, when he quit, he took his $80 million, but the company was, really not doing very well. But people tend to forget that in the success Apple has today. But the first 10 or so years was one negative story after another.
Right.
Thanks.
Well, one more thing I'll say about venture capitalists and their role in this story is one of them, Tim Draper, was an early investor. Actually, the earliest investor in Theranos. He cut Elizabeth her first $1 million check. And there was a family connection there, which was that she and her parents had lived next door to the Drapers in Woodside, California, at one point when she was younger. But Draper, ironically, I don't think Draper was defrauded because he came in early, and so at that stage, Theranos was basically a promise, and he knew that, as with all early stage startups, what the odds are. The odds are that this is going to become another Facebook or Apple, or very low. But he has since, come out as a big vocal supporter of Elizabeth Holmes, even to this day.
Really?
And his attitude seems to be that just because Elizabeth was, a smart young girl with a cool vision in Silicon Valley, that excuses everything. That the entrepreneur's ambition and imagination, that they excuse white-collar crime. And I think that's a really bad message.
Yeah, and hopefully that he's in a minority. Thank you so much for your reporting.
Thank you.
John, thank you very much.